Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Grantmakers in the Arts 2019 webinar, After the Story Comes a Critique, Funders Leading Narrative Change Efforts. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. This is the last webinar of our Narrative Change series, and today we consider the role of the critic in shaping narratives. The storyteller offers a narrative and shared experience that consumers can connect to, while critics can intercede with a counter-story, offer deeper historical exposition, or highlight an alternative shared experience while advocating for silenced voices. But how does this change when critics from the Alana community, or African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, or Native American community, offer perspectives? So today we're glad you've joined us to have Elizabeth Méndez, Director of Voice, Creativity, and Culture from the Nathan Cummings Foundation, and Chi-hui, Program Officer of Just Films, Creativity, and Free Expression from the Ford Foundation, leading a discussion on media critique. And they'll speak to their collaborative project, Critical Minded, and share thoughts on how funders can lead narrative change efforts. Elizabeth Méndez directs the Nathan Cummings Foundation's Voice, Creativity, and Culture portfolio, focusing on the Foundation's investment in the arts, pop culture, and media. Prior to joining Nathan Cummings, she worked at the Ford Foundation on its journalism portfolio, and then at the Cerdna Foundation, where she led the Artists Engaging in Social Change portfolio. Chi-hui, an acclaimed, dropped my headsets, everyone. Chi-hui, an acclaimed curator, film director, and educator, makes grants in film, new media, and visual storytelling for the Foundation's Just Films program, with global experience supporting artists. Before joining the Foundation in 2015, Yang worked extensively as a film and video curator, including as a selection committee member for MoMA's documentary Fortnight, consulting series producer for PBS's POV, and curator of Comcast Cinema Asian America Video On Demand service. At the very end of this presentation, I'll be joining to facilitate Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Chi-hui and Elizabeth. Elizabeth, why don't you get us started?
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to GIA for the opportunity to share about our Critical Minded program. And Sherilyn, thank you so much for the introduction. So today what we really wanted to do was share a little bit about kind of our narrative change work, both at the Nathan Cummings Foundation and at the Ford Foundation, and B, how we see cultural criticism and specifically racial equity within cultural criticism fitting into that. So the goal of this conversation is to offer you all a sense of how this body of work came about. This is a collaborative. It started with Ford and Chi-hui and myself at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, how it's growing and some of the key questions that we're wrestling with. And we also really want to hear from you all about either work that you've done in the cultural criticism arena, questions you may have, and opportunities for us to sort of grapple together. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I want to pass it off to my august colleague, Chi-hui.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. And again, thanks to GIA as well. And just to add a couple notes to what Elizabeth said, is that, I think that within each of our institutions, we've been experimenting a fair amount with narrative change and narrative shift strategies, as many folks are doing. And we're excited to share some of the experiments that we've been doing, and also see how that, sits and how that rhymes with what other people's experiences have been. And, I think what might characterize our thinking around narrative shift is our focus on having the artist at the center of that effort. And what does it mean to have the artist or the critic at the center of narrative shift strategies? And through talking a bit about Critical Minded, I hope that we get to some of those questions. And how we've structured the webinar today is that I think we have the last 15 to 20 minutes for conversation Q&A. But we thought we'd start by a bit about ourselves, just to frame up our own practices and how we approach some of these questions. And then go a bit into a few details about how we at our respective institutions at Ford Foundation and at Nathan Cummings, we've been approaching some of the narrative shift questions through our grant making. We'll pivot to a couple thoughts on narrative shift more broadly, and then move into the meat of the conversation, which would be some details about Critical Minded and how to think about cultural criticism through a narrative shift lens, or vice versa, narrative shift through a cultural criticism lens. And with that, I'm going to throw it back over to Elizabeth to really tell a bit about herself, and then we'll keep on going forward.
Thank you so much, Chi-hui. So I, as Sherilyn shared earlier, I'm the director of the Voice, Creativity, and Culture program at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. And I think one of the things that I've really appreciated and also wrestled with about this role is the fact that I am working within the context of a social justice foundation that that works for justice for people on the planet, and that also has an arts component to it. And so there's often been a question about how those different components fit together and how the arts relates to social justice. And how the arts relates to social justice in a way that isn't instrumentalizing artists or instrumentalizing arts organizations, but instead really recognizes their power and their capacity to actually transform discourse and our collective imagination, I would say. I come to this as a recovering music critic, as somebody who wrote for a number of years about specifically hip-hop and then other kinds of music more broadly. And in that work, I came to the conclusion that cultural criticism sort of ignited discourse and ignited conversations about culture that made it come alive for people and help people see additional layers of an artwork that might not have been initially apparent to them. And so one of the places that I'll just say briefly, and if anybody wants to go down memory lane with me a little bit later, I'm more than happy to, but one place where that was really impactful for me is a piece that I did about Jay-Z, the rapper, many years ago, looking at kind of the tension between materialism and revolutionary chic. There was a period during which he was wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. Some of you may remember that period. And so I wrote about the tension between his decision to wear the t-shirt and then at the same time to wear a large diamond-encrusted gold piece over it. Jay-Z read that essay and actually responded to it in one of his songs called Public Service Announcement. And then subsequently, as you all can see from this slide, in the book Jay-Z Decoded, where he explains the origin of a number of his songs, he tells the story of reading my essay and then responding to it in his song. That experience made me realize that criticism, that is, many artists really feed on criticism, and criticism can play this essential role in driving culture forward, even as I think in many cases, if you've ever been a critic, it is a challenging role also to play, because a lot of people, the artists hate you, a lot of people hate you. But in this case, I really saw an artist who was interested in engaging with criticism, and it actually complicated his work, I think, in a fruitful way. It did not lead to royalties for me, which is why I still have a job. But it was nonetheless, it was a really interesting experience. So that was sort of the seed for this notion that cultural criticism can enrich our discourse and help us hold multiple truths simultaneously. You don't have to agree with a great artist. You can engage with them, and the notion that that could be a valuable contribution. So I'll pass it over now to Chi-hui to talk a little bit about his experiences as a curator and how that has informed his thinking about criticism and curation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So as Sherilyn mentioned earlier, I've worked primarily as a film curator, and so a lot of the frame that I bring to philanthropy is a frame of knowledge production and dissemination, which is centered on those who play the role of shaping the meta conversation or narrative around how arts and culture are in conversation with politics. And I think that the role of the curator is very much aligned with the role of the critic, in that it's a position like philanthropy where you can see quite far ahead. You have a long-range view of what is being produced or being done, and you're able to tell the larger story of that. And so a lot of my work has been through curating. I think about it as a practice of combustion and of radical juxtaposition, of putting many different pieces in conversation with each other to tell a larger story. And I think that is very much narrative work at its core. And a couple examples of how that was practiced in the past. For many years I was the the director of the San Francisco Asian American Film Festival. And the festival screened about 120 films each year, and a big part of that practice was not only to show the individual films, but to really think through what was the larger story that they told. And I think one of the grander narratives and themes that we really focused on through the curation of it was to define Asian America as a dynamic, ever-expanding idea, and to move against the notion of identity or culture as being essentialized both from within the Asian American community or outside. And we did that through, again, radical juxtaposition, films from Palestine, Iran, Kazakhstan, alongside Asian American works, works which were, PBS documentaries alongside much more conceptual work to really expand the vocabulary and idea of what Asian America is and how it could be articulated. And so it was that larger story that I was very much drawn to through the curation of a program. And it carried through the work that I did with MoMA, with documentary Fortnight, where, again, a lot of the work there was to understand the body of work being done and how to tell the larger story through it. One anecdote was a number of years ago, we presented a number of films, but two in particular which we put alongside each other was Stanley Nelson's film about the Black Panther Party, Black Panther Vanguard of the Revolution, which was more of a traditional interview and archival PBS documentary, and putting that alongside a film by the more experimental filmmaker Kevin Jerome Everson called Park Lanes, which was an 8-hour durational film that observed a full day of work by Black and brown workers in a factory. Very different traditions, languages, but a very linked commitment to understand the Black body in historical, political, and economic context. And so by putting these two alongside each other, there was a larger conversation that was opened up between these artists about these much larger issues. So in a lot of ways, I think that's the perspective I bring to both Critical Minded as well as to my work in philanthropy. It is, I think a lot about what is the infrastructure of arts, what's behind the scenes, what are the engines for dissemination and larger narrative shaping, and who plays those roles. And I think that we'll be getting a bit more into that as we move through this webinar.
So thank you, Chi-hui. And I think one thing I'll also say about Chi-hui's background in curatorial practice is that and I'm curious whether any of the folks on this call have contributed to some of that work around diversifying the ranks of curators in different contexts. But we were certainly inspired by that work, and it's informed our thinking around what we might do in the context of criticism. So there's very much kind of an overlay, and as Chi-hui says, we're thinking about what's the behind the scenes, either accelerant or amplifier or in some way essential ingredient in, the role that the arts can play in these broader contexts. So with that, I'll just say quickly, as I mentioned before, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, we're a family foundation, 25 years old, pursuing justice for people on the planet. And we have a long history of investing in artistic practice with an awareness of how inequality has decreased the access of certain institutions to resources, to visibility, and all those things. And so we do have this history, and at the same time, I think one of the big kind of questions that many of us have been wrestling with both within this foundation and among others, is the question of scale and how, powerful community-based practices, how they might either be magnified or at least be in conversation with other sectors. And so a lot of our thinking, for example, we were among the co-founders of a funding initiative called the Pop Culture Collaborative, which was really about thinking about the role that, so we had a long history of investing in small nonprofit arts organizations, predominantly people of color led. But then the question became, okay, well, what about the entertainment industry? What about these more for-profit arts contexts? Is there a role that they can play in transforming the way that we think about ourselves and each other in a way that could amplify and accelerate our broader goals of a juster and more democratic society? And so I think those have been some of the key questions that the Nathan Cummings Foundation has been asking internally and externally. Those are questions that I, within the arts and culture investment strategies, I hold, but a lot of my colleagues are also thinking about them in the context of how they approach, for example, environmental justice work and ensure that artists and other storytellers are incorporated into those processes, and that we're reaching broader audiences with messages that originate from the people most affected by these issues. So that's what I would say. We also have an exhibition program right now. In case anybody's in New York City, you have my invitation to come and visit. Our new show is called Like the Waters We Rise, and it's about climate justice in print, and it really aims to sort of capture a variety of moments in the environmental justice world, from Standing Rock to what just happened in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria, and capture the artistic practice that came out of it, and that articulated a set of perspectives that have stayed on and have really helped drive the conversation. So this is a different way that we're playing that role, but the exhibition feels like a really important celebration of the role that the arts have played in the climate justice movement.
Mm-hmm.
Chi-hui.
And just a couple of notes about narrative change work at Ford Foundation. I think that Ford's focus is on addressing inequality. Excuse me, and it's I think that built into our strategy is a recognition that one of the primary drivers of inequality is cultural narrative. The stories that we tell ourselves and each other, and how that defines our values, beliefs, and actions. So there's a recognition that narrative is a driver of inequality, but also recognition, as many folks are thinking about, that narrative is one of the primary tools to address inequality too, right, alongside many of our traditional tools, policy, advocacy, litigation, et cetera. And I would say that, across Ford's areas, narrative shift work is very much mainstream. I think everyone's very on board and very interested in its powers. And there's a lot of different types of experiments that are happening within Ford in all different areas, and I think it's really exciting. And that's both from producing content to connecting artists with advocacy organizations, and a strong understanding of the difference between strategic communications and narrative work, and understanding how those two work together. I want to take just a minute just to point out a couple of the different types of narrative shift projects that we've been working on here that might illustrate this. One is a fellowship that we've recently created with Union Docs, which is an exhibition organization, an education organization in New York. And this is a fellowship for collaborative research and documentary art. And how it's structured is it's a year-long fellowship for 4 pairs of individuals, each pair being composed of a filmmaker and a writer. And they applied with a shared question. And their fellowship is at the service of that question. And the purpose of the fellowship is, one, to deepen both practices of the writer and the filmmaker, to produce a body of work about that question, but also to produce a body of writing about that question and how films that address that question are taking impact. So it's both about producing the content and the discourse around the content too. And I think that in a lot of ways, narrative shift to me is very much follows sort of like a discourse theory of change. And it's changing the conversation around the question. And so how do we do that? And in a lot of ways, as we'll talk more about, it is through the dissemination and the critical analysis of those ideas. And so we're piloting this fellowship this year, but we're really excited about what it can offer, because there's, again, a number of different outcomes, including for philanthropy, a way to understand how films about social justice topics are influencing, shifting discourse, and having a body of work, of writing to help explain that. The second one that I'll mention is a film called Decade of Fire, which many folks may have seen. It broadcast just last month on public television. This is a film about the burning of the Bronx in the 1970s. And this film was co-funded by the Just Films Initiative, which I work in, and our Just Cities and Regions Initiative, who have been doing a lot of deep narrative work. And just a couple notes, part of the collaboration was to help the storytellers to really help clarify a lot of the larger narratives that the film was hitting on, including, this notion that housing inequality is a choice, that the burning of the Bronx was not the fault of the inhabitants of the Bronx. It was an intentional policy decision. Another narrative was, so much of what allowed the Bronx communities to sustain themselves over time was a lot of sweat equity, right, the sweat equity movement, but working with the filmmakers to make sure that that wasn't the end of that narrative, that there was sweat equity, but ultimately a lot of the models that were created were thrown back to government to make sure that government took those up and rounding out that narrative arc so that it doesn't end with individuals, but it ends with government. So our work with the film team was to help, and again, they were already very much on board with this, but help to clarify and synthesize a lot of these key narratives that, that were so important for the film to hit. One last thing that I'll throw out that's kind of exciting is that our office in India has been thinking a lot about how to address gender-based violence. And one idea that they have right now is they notice that in India and in the, there's a real lack of images of women that do not reinforce gender stereotypes. And so an idea that they have is to actually create a new database of stock images for advertisers, filmmakers, artists to be able to use, which portray women in very different realms in much more powerful and equitable positions. And so that's an intervention point in the visual narrative of individuals, which then kind of feeds into the larger social narrative too. So there's lots of these different types of experiments that are happening that we're really excited about. And just to continue, Elizabeth and I, just before we pivot over to the our conversation about critical minded, wanted just to give a couple other notes about how we're thinking about narrative shift. And I wanted to bring up another film example because I work on the film side, and this is a film called Hale County This Morning, This Evening, which I think many folks may have seen. It was nominated for an Oscar last year, made by an African-American filmmaker in the Black Belt of the country, and it really explores everyday Black life in Alabama. And the filmmaker Ramel Ross, very core to this project was this notion of visual justice. Right? This notion that so much of what controls the narratives of individuals is how they are represented visually, and how if you are trapped by the visual economy, then how do you get outside of that? And if the visual economy reinforces the narratives that we tell each other about other folks, then they are in concert, and that relationship needs to be disrupted. And so this film is a documentary, but it's non-narrative. It's associative. It's much more elliptical, poetic, and experimental. And in a lot of ways, it's non-narrative. It resists reproducing controlling narratives about individuals through its visuality. It's about quotidian Black life in the South. It doesn't add up to any of these larger narratives about bootstraps, overcome the odds, or any of the other dominant narratives that Black communities are subject to in the dominant media. And so baked into this film is this notion of narrative justice and visual justice. And in a lot of ways, I think that I see these as building blocks for narrative shift. What are all the different constituents of how narratives are formed, and how do we address them at their roots so that together there's a different sort of set of tools that folks are building narratives from.
And so, speaking of tools, I think one of the things that we talk a lot about, that Chi-hui and I talked a lot about, is the question of how audiences are able to go from being sort of passive recipients of cultural practices to being active participants in shaping culture. And so, even as they may be sitting in the same dark movie theater, their relationship to the film may be quite different if their critical thinking capacities are engaged, and if they're simultaneously appreciating the film and dissecting the film and analyzing the film, or even if that happens afterwards. I think one of the really important things that I want to note is that when we talk about narrative change, that doesn't imply from where, it doesn't make clear where we're going and from where we're coming, right? Narrative change can be, in the direction of a less just society, in the direction of a more misogynistic society, in the direction of a more racist society. And so we wanted to share this example The Birth of a Nation, I would argue that The Birth of a Nation is probably one of the most seductive examples of narrative power in pop culture, to the point where it was actually screened at the White House by Woodrow Wilson in 1915. So, I'm sure each of you on this call can think of an example of a cultural, of a book, of a piece of some kind of artistic production that in some way either articulates a dominant narrative, perhaps a problematic narrative, perhaps a transgressive narrative, a narrative of liberation, a narrative of potential, of possibility, of imagination. And I think the argument that Chi-hui and I would make is that much of the time, at least in my conversations here at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, the people who tend to dominate the narrative change conversation tend to be narrative strategists, people who come out of more of a sort of policy and campaign context. And it's very rare that artists are in the mix in those conversations. And so I think, my goal in the role that I've been in here, in the conversations that I've participated in, is to say that I believe that our artists are the most potent, are some of the most potent emissaries of national mythologies, be it the American dream, or be it some of the gender stereotypes, or on the flip side, the moments when gender actually shifts, the way that we see gender, the way that we hold gender shifts, right? You see that in different artistic practices, and so I think what we've been trying to do is articulate that potential and that power, and ensure that artists have a seat at the table when we talk about artists. So artists have a seat at the table when we talk about narrative, and then also that critics and the people who interpret art, analyze art, geek out about art are also part of that process.
And pivoting over to talk with folks a bit more specifically about critical minded, we want to start with a couple of stats. So this first one, 6 out of 6 of the most influential visual art critics are white. 5 out of 6 of these critics are men. And there are 27 white male film critics for each woman of color film critic. And so, as you can see, the numbers tell us that there is enormous discrepancy in who is, if politics is played out through culture, then who is analyzing culture and arbitrating culture has a very strong influence. And if there is such a skewed demographic and who is doing that very important work, then this needs to be addressed. And in a lot of ways, as Elizabeth mentioned, if artists are, the original narrative shift agents through their practices, if we believe that artists can see into the future and are the early warning systems for what is to come, then what is the way in which we amplify the work of artists? And, in a lot of ways, if we have a theater piece or a dance piece, what allows those pieces to travel beyond the limited audiences that can go see them, right? Who can come see the Carrie James Marshall show in the cities that it goes to? Very few. But who can be informed and influenced by those shows, by the ideas in those shows? Everybody. And the primary vehicle through which those ideas can move is through the word, through the critic. And critics are those forces, as many folks know, that create value, right? That create context and historical context for art. Critics are those often who create the canons. So if we think about the longer term game of who is informing culture and creating the narratives and allowing the work of artists to be able to be lifted up, it is the critic who plays a very important role. And before we get into the sort of what we're doing with Critical Minded, we wanted to give just a few examples of a couple articles that we thought were doing this work, that are doing this really incredible work. The first one that I wanted to share is this article that was printed in Vox about a year and a half ago. And this was printed right during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And and during that time, there was so much conversation around, what could have informed his actions. And the author, who is a woman, wanted to disrupt the narrative used to discount the allegations of rape made against Brett Kavanaugh, namely that it couldn't have happened because if it had, someone would have said so at the time. That was the dominant narrative, that sort of protected Brett Kavanaugh. And the article looked to the pop cultural context of the early 1980s when the rape took place in the film 16 Candles, which was, as many of us know, a cultural touchstone. And if folks remember, the film normalizes rape culture through plot lines that made it into a harmless high school pastime. And this article argued that cultural context and the social permissions that it can give matter and need to be part of the conversation. So this is a sort of a media analysis piece that really helped to contest the larger narratives that were coming up to protect Brett Kavanaugh during this time. So, again, a pop culture media analysis that's doing a lot of the larger work of understanding the historical moment. Another piece is a great review that Hilton Als, who really is, I think, probably the most well-recognized critic of color operating in this country, the theater critic for the New Yorker magazine. This is a review that he did of the Bruce Springsteen musical that came out on Broadway a couple of years ago. And what I really loved about this piece is that it was a big two-page spread, but the full first half was Hilton Als being a skeptic to Bruce Springsteen, not affirming the sort of universal notion of his genius, but really thinking through what troubled him about Springsteen. And I'm just going to read a line from his piece. In the 80s, I'm quoting Hilton Als, in the 80s, for example, when I looked at the rabble-rouser's tousled black hair, his bandana, and his long face and prominent jaw, I saw nothing but danger signals, mostly that had to do with race and class. My Springsteen problem ultimately was my problem with white masculinity in general. Was it possible for straight white men to empathize with anything other than themselves in the way that Joni Mitchell, say, could identify with that black crow, or Laura Nyro with all the inhabitants of her native New York, or Chaka Khan with the confusion and joy of a genderless world? And what I appreciate about this piece is that it decenters the white authority critic as the arbiter of culture and as the universal voice. And it also it questions some of the genius of Bruce Springsteen, and it offers an analysis of him from a queer black male perspective. And again, I think one of the dominant notions of criticism is that it speaks from a place of authority, and that many times these critics have a universal voice. I think that's often what's held against critics of color, that they don't have a universal voice, but none do. And this is a piece which I think really speaks to the multiplicity of analyses that we really need.
So thank you, Chi-hui, and I think many of us have had some form of Springsteen problem, depending on what it is. But so this one, I think one of the things that we come back to again and again is the notion that art matters, right? That artists matter, and that artists have the capacity to imagine, beyond our current reality, and then also they have the capacity to reinforce our current reality in many problematic ways. And so this piece is by Carolina Miranda, who is one of very, very few Latinas writing about culture on a regular basis. She writes for the LA Times. She also played a big role in the recent unionization push. And I saw her last week, and she said, organizing is not that glamorous. 15 months of just, a lot of conversations with a lot of cranky people. But nonetheless, they just completed their unionization effort, which I think is an interesting example of how culture relates to, broader questions of justice. Anyway, in this piece, which I encourage you all to read, and we can share the link afterwards, she makes the case that the absence of Latinos, Latinas, Latinx people in culture, in museums, in entertainment, in all of these different spaces has actually played a role in creating potential for attacks like what happened in El Paso. So here's a little quote from what she said. Rendering an entire segment of the population invisible makes the cultural arena complicit in a marginalization that is entering increasingly dangerous territory. So the thing that I think is really interesting about this piece, one thing I should say is that Carolina was a founding advisory board member of Critical Minded. She's a dear friend of this effort. And you know, she's basically approaching a political or approaching an issue that I think most people analyze sort of in a political context. She's approaching it from the cultural realm. And she's making, I think, a very powerful argument that the erasure of Latinx, the Latinx community in all of these different places has led to, basically has enabled stereotypes to thrive. And I actually was thinking about it, you know, reviewing some of the research on how Latinx people, particularly immigrants, but also more broadly, are portrayed in entertainment and in the media. And I perceive it as being either docile or dangerous. Those are the two options. And so in this piece, Carolina really expresses that. And something that I found quite powerful is that that article has traveled all over the place, and I actually was at a gathering of the Pop Culture Collaborative last week, and a Latino, I believe he's an agent, I'm not exactly sure what his title is, but he works at Endeavor Entertainment, which is you know, works to package TV shows. He circulated that article among his colleagues as a way of trying to push them to take on more Latino content. So her work is shifting the conversation in interesting and I think impactful places in terms of not just the kind of political sphere, but also the culture sphere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think that what we want to do is take the last about 8 to 10 minutes of our presentation to share with you some of the work of Critical Minded. And hopefully some of these examples have been illustrative of what the focus is on. But you know, the initiative began as a convening in 2017 when we brought together 50 critics of color across disciplines and generations to understand the state of their field. We made some exploratory grants in 2018, and it is more formally launching in 2020. And as a fund, which has a number of donors contributing, including Ford, Cummings, Wellspring Advisors, Cerdna, MacArthur Foundations, and others we're in conversation with.
As an initiative, you know, as an initiative, not as a fund. Yes.
As an initiative. Yeah, as an initiative. And that's the point of conversation as well. But the problem is addressing is racial equity and cultural criticism. And the long-term goal is to ensure that critics of color in the U.S. are better resourced and valued as an essential to a thriving cultural sector and an inclusive democracy. And that criticism plays a more visible role in amplifying new narratives and radical imagination for justice. And you know, its core argument is that, you know, cultural criticism is an underutilized lever to achieve social change. That to allow artists and their art to do the larger narrative shifting that we've been talking about, the ideas embedded in their work must travel and influence public discourse. And that's the role of the critic, you know, to frame, to analyze, and interpret art for the public, and to ignite informed discourse around cultural and politics. And one quote that I want to throw out is what Amiri Baraka wrote about jazz. He wrote, "The people made bebop. The question the critic must ask is, why?" You know, and I think toward that, it's bringing sociology, gender, and economic lenses to art and culture is essential to criticism and helps create conversations about much larger issues.
And I think, sorry, go ahead.
And yeah, go ahead. No, I was going to say that who writes it matters.
Absolutely, and those stats that we shared earlier are you know, quite damning in the context of you know, all of the artists of color who I think are in many ways being more recognized than they were in the past, and so you have this wonderful surge of artistic production and visibility and sometimes resources and access, and then you have an asymmetry in terms of who's actually leading the conversation about that work. But I also want to say something that I think is really important, which is that we know that people want to talk about culture because we see it online and we can really trace it in these very powerful ways. And so a number of the advisors in our initial, when we started out, we should be clear that part of our thinking around how we developed the Critical Minded Initiative was that we wanted critics to be at the center. And so when we had that initial gathering that Chi-hui mentioned, I think the age range was maybe from 23 to 73, something like that. We asked those critics what they needed, what worked for them in terms of resources, support, relationships, and what they were really struggling with. And that the data that we collected from them led us to the design process for what Critical Minded has gone on to be. So I think that's important to say. And then I also want to note that among that group who helped inform our initial gathering was Eve Ewing, Carolina Miranda, Jessica Lin, who's a governing board member now, and a number of other Huasu and a number of other extraordinary critics, some of whom are largely practicing criticism online. And so if you look at, if you think about even, the example of Oscar So White, right, or the conversations that have happened around Scandal, or conversations that have happened around a lot of different musicians, you see that people want to talk about culture, right? What happens is that the places where you can actually get paid to do that work are fewer and further between. And the few people who have managed to hold on to sort of these tenured roles are less and less representative of the larger cultural conversation that's happening. So I think that's an important point to make. And then another note is that Chi-hui and I had the opportunity to write an op-ed for the New York Times, which was a kind of an amazing experience because it put us a little bit in the position that the writers who we are supporting where they were at. So it came out as the dominance of the white male critic. That was the more scandalous version of the title. The original title, I think, was just "We Need More Critics of Color," but it did not perform as well. We learned from our editor at the New York Times. But the piece basically articulated this argument that cultural criticism is civic infrastructure, that critical thinking, especially in the context of the fake news universe that we're operating within, in which it is harder and harder for people to discern what's real, what's fake. And then, of course, when we talk about cultural criticism, we're responding in many cases to fictional worlds, to imaginary worlds, but we're interrogating them from a place of truth and curiosity, right? And so our argument is that skill set and that sort of level of the nuance, the ability to hold multiple positions simultaneously, to argue without getting personal about it, to be in principled, enthusiastic debate about culture or politics is more needed than ever. And so the argument I think that we were making is not just that that criticism matters to artists or criticism matters to arts institutions, but really that criticism matters to the society as a whole, to democracy, right? Our ability to really engage with ideas is a core, civic capacity, is a core democratic capacity. So our article came out. And I think one of the things that we really remarked on was the degree to which it got picked up in social media, which was really important for us to observe, I think, because that's an experience that many of the writers we work with have, and something that neither one of us had done. I had done it a while ago, but it had been a while for me. And we saw how the ideas traveled. We saw, folks in Hollywood responded, in publishing, in all kinds of sectors. And actually, this is some of the tweets. I'm not a big tweeter, but I was very appreciative of people's interest in the ideas and their engagement with them. And then also subsequently, we wound up having conversations with folks at the New York Times. One of the big issues that came out of the piece was that the New York Times is one of the places where the critical core is whitest. And so many people were saying, okay, the New York Times publishes this article, but why don't they take their own advice, right? And so the Times, we've been in conversation with them about what they might do, although the reality is, I think we want to continue to try and hold them accountable, because at this point, we don't see a whole lot of change. Chi-hui, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, you know, I think the big question that we're thinking about is if criticism is this key infrastructure that needs to be robust and to be running alongside the artists, then how do we support that? What is the infrastructure that allows that infrastructure to operate, right? And so to wrap up our presentation section, we thought we'd give a few examples of some of the grants that we've made, just to give a sense for what that work has been. One bucket of granting that we've been doing has been a small, what we've been calling a dinner party fund. Small grants around $1,000 to $2,000 for critics in different cities to build community and to bring together different cohorts of critics and build a larger conversation to share best practices, but also just kind of build that conversation, right? So here's an image from the Latinx Project gathering in New York City that brought together Latinx critics from many different disciplines for networking and community building. Another has been the opportunity to convene and bring critics to key arts events to help generate the discourse coming from them, right? Because many of these arts events can feed up to shape national conversations. And so over the past couple of years, we've supported diverse critics to attend the Sundance Film Festival. The image that you're seeing here is a number of critics that we supported to attend the Site Santa Fe Biennial in New Mexico, which was indigenously curated, had a very strong indigenous roster of artists, but for whom the group of critics attending were not very diverse. And so we helped support a group of Latinx and indigenous critics to attend to really be part at the beginning levels of shaping the conversation, the national conversation from that art exhibition.
So we also, and we can talk more about this, we want to make sure that there's plenty of time for you all to ask questions. So just super quickly, we've made a couple of investments thus far in existing outlets that prioritize the voices of critics of color. One of them is Hyperallergic, which you may be familiar with. And then also some training programs, the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Fellowship in Cultural Journalism, and research. This one, the USC Annenberg report, is the one that we drew on in the slide earlier that showed that there are 27 white male film critics for every one woman of color film critic. And let's just kind of, I think we should wrap up at this point, Chi-hui, just to make sure that folks have a chance to chime in. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Would love folks' thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elizabeth and Chi-hui. That was fantastic. I thought it was awesome that you called out just generally thinking about narrative shift and narrative change. That doesn't indicate any particular direction. So being strategic about what direction you're shifting a narrative is important. Bringing artists to the table and cultural context, those are really huge themes that I thought were great that you called out. So with our Q&A, if you present your questions in the Q&A box to the bottom of your screen, be sure to direct the question to a specific person if you'd like to. And if you would like for it to be for both, then you can leave it without a specific person. And we already do have our first question, and I'll open it up to both of you. So the person asks, how can we challenge the assumption that the white male voice is universal and the voice of color, gender, sexual orientation is not, when the very fact that othering can sideline alternative voices? Is it simply a matter of increasing the number of alternate voices, or do we need something else to break through and open up the possibilities?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, I think raising, I guess for me, it's a couple things. One is raising the point that nobody's, as Chi-hui said earlier, nobody's perspective is universal, and the specificity of each person's voice is where their value comes from, their capacity to be illuminating and useful in their perspectives. So there's that. I think you know, we're seeing a couple of different thrusts. One is, you know, obviously we're doing the work of trying to support critics of color and amplify their voices. And then there's also folks who are actually deliberately interrogating white critics in different ways, online, particularly, but I think there's been some organizing around that as well. So in Chicago, there was a case when a woman, a theater critic, published a review that many considered to be very egregious of a play, and that led to a lot of internal conversation about how that critic had, the impact that she had had over the years, and the narrowness of her perspective and the problematics of it. And so I think there's a few different ways that, that one might approach it, but I really believe that a combination of kind of surfacing the brilliance of voices that have been excluded is, to me, is a really big part of it, as well as accountability for the voices that are at the center consistently. Chi-hui, do you want to add anything?
I'll just say that, I think a big part of our work is to create these new centers of gravity, of critical gravity, that can inform and that people need to sort of bend to, right? And I think that and one of our initiatives for the coming year is to do an RFP for POC-led and serving publications, knowing that that is the pipeline. That's where the risk-taking happens with emerging critics. And where the editors and the publishers and the writers come from. And I think that to the question of how do we, and I think a lot of it, to answer the question, is about building up the visibility and the voice of critics so that they are in the conversation, because it is not about whether one voice is more authoritative than another, but it's about the kind of analysis that the voice brings and the relevance that has and how it helps us understand the world. Right? And I think that the more in circulation, that's our theory, it helps to move that forward.
Great. Thank you for that. Now, specifically calling out racial equity in narrative change and narrative shift, how can we call narrative change strategy out as a strategy specifically towards funding for racial equity? And either one of you can jump in on this one.
Well, maybe I'll start by saying that, within at Forward, an operating question that we ask every day is, who is telling what story from what perspective? And I think that with the knowledge that there is a traditional way in which that equation has operated, and usually it's more powerful telling the stories of the marginalized. And it's not enough just to have content about the marginalized, but the process in which the storytelling happens must be equitable and inclusive as well, right? So if we scramble that question, who is telling what story from what perspective, and then that can help to scramble the larger power dynamics that reflects in society, right? And so I think that to me is a key question of who is included in the process of storytelling and building racial equity as key to that. Because I think central to this effort too is this notion of cultural power, right? Who are we building the cultural power of? And how does cultural power help to shape political, economic, and other types of power, right? And so if there's racial equity even at the discourse level of culture, that allows the equation to sort of move on up.
And I would argue also that cultural power is generally an articulation of other types of power, right? If you look at who calls the shots within most museums, within most media companies, within most entertainment companies, it's the same people that are calling the shots in Washington, D.C. right now.
Great. Great. So someone is wondering about the onboarding process within your respective foundations and how challenging it was to persuade your leadership to support this initiative, the Critical Minded Initiative. So I know either one of you can speak to this, but what was the experience like in getting this started?
That's such a great question. So I will say that in my previous role at the Cerna Foundation, I had been asking a question about where critics fit into the broader philanthropic ecology for quite some time, because I had worked as a journalism funder at the Ford Foundation, and then I was an arts funder at Cerna, and it seemed like critics just fell through the cracks. And I was always sort of surprised when I was in the Cerna world that none of the artists that we really funded, or very few of the artists that we funded really got written about, right? And so I thought there's a missing link here, right? So how do we understand that missing link? Given that I, had come up through the alternative weekly universe, that I'd written for Vibe magazine and Honey and all these places that no longer really exist. So I was worried about the implications of the kind of emaciation of that ecosystem. So when I was at CERNA, I did this report. I commissioned a report from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting with the goal of understanding what the demographics of people working in major arts publications were. What came back was pretty much what you all saw, but at the time, the team I was working with was not really interested in cultural criticism. And so it was actually, it was a bit of a challenge because I wanted, it was something I really wanted to do, and it just didn't come together. I stayed in conversation with colleagues at the Ford Foundation. Elizabeth Alexander was at the Ford Foundation. I shared the idea with them before I went to the Nathan Cummings Foundation. And Elizabeth, who had been a critic and is an artist herself, and at the time was the director of the arts and culture team at Ford, was really interested. Chi-hui was really interested. There was sort of a critical mass of people at Ford who thought this was an interesting concept. And when I came into the Nathan Cummings Foundation, the president here, Sharon Alpert, was also really interested. So I definitely, for 4 years at CERNA wanted to do it and didn't have the go-ahead, but kept on pushing in terms of having the conversation. And then when I got to the Nathan Cummings Foundation, there was Chi-hui, and we ran with it.
Mm-hmm. I'll just say very briefly that I was really fortunate. At Ford, there was already very much a grounded conversation around these areas in parallel areas, a very robust conversation around narrative, and also a very robust conversation around diversifying museum curatorships. And I think that, critics occupying similar types of gatekeeping and value creating functions. So it landed very much within that. So I think it's well received. Also, the fact that we recognized that there was almost very little track record in philanthropy around criticism, and it being an area that was really, there was a great opportunity for exploration and for discovery, I think was also something which was, which helped generate a lot of interest for it. One more thing that I'll say is that, like on my side, I work alongside journalism and arts and culture, and criticism is something that syncs together all of these areas, right? And it's cross sector. Its challenges are many. It's rooted in the challenges facing the journalism sector and the arts sector, and racial equity as well, right? So I think that the challenges are complex. And in recognition of that, here was an intervention that could address many of these questions through one idea.
All right, awesome. Thank you for that. I have one more question, and then for those of you, just given our time, for those of you whose questions we haven't gotten to, we'll make sure to direct those to the presenters after the webinar so that we can share answers for you. But I want to know, and I think other people are wondering, which critics have inspired you the most? And that's for both of you.
So I'll say Joan Morgan, Alma Guillermo Prieto, Jeff Chang. Those are a few.
Yeah, and I'll add Alan Sekula, who is more of a Marxist theorist around photography, who did some incredible writing. And currently I've been really enjoying Aruna D'Souza's writing. She's a New York-based critic.
Who's also on our board.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we could finish this by saying that, with Critical Minded, we've sort of reached the end of our initial phase, which is like a lot of the fundraising piece phase and case making, and we're about to move into more.
We're open for more money.
We're moving into the implementation phase in 2020, which is really exciting, and so there's naturally a lot of transitions happening. And one thing that I did want to just, perhaps as a note to end on, is to update folks on a really exciting change for our dear friend Elizabeth Méndez-Berry, who, as you know, has been at Nathan Cummings for a number of years, and starting next year will be transitioning out of Foundation into a new position at One World Publishing imprint. As its vice president and executive editor. And so it's a really exciting opportunity for her. I want to send her our big congratulations. And also that we will continue to be working with Elizabeth on our governance board for Critical Minded too. So congratulations, Elizabeth.
Thank you, and I'll be working with some great cultural critics, including Ta-Nehisi Coates, Jenna Wortham, Kimberly Drew, folks who participated in our initial gathering and who we consider to be part of the Critical Minded family. So thank you, Chi-hui, and you all can't get rid of me, but we really, really appreciate the opportunity to share about this work today.
Yes, thank you. And as all of you know, Elizabeth also is, or may not know, is also one of our board members. So we definitely send you all of the good vibes, and we know that you are going to be doing awesome, awesome work as you continue with your writing, and so we're thankful to have had you, and I'm excited to see what's next.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and on that note, we have come to the end of our session. I want to say thank you once again to Chi-hui and Elizabeth for their awesome presentation, offering so much insight. And in follow-up, we will send out a recording of this presentation as well as a link to the slides, and you'll be able to look through the slides, and we'll be sure to address some of the questions that many of you asked that we didn't get to. We invite you to take a brief survey that we'll share immediately following this webinar, because your feedback is incredibly important to us as we design our future programming. If you have further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, and we thank you again for joining us. Have an awesome day.